All right, so we're diving into Erasmus of Rotterdam today.
Sounds fun.
Yeah, our listeners are really curious about him and, specifically whether he was a social five on the Enneagram.
Ah, I see
And
now.
honestly, I am too.
Yeah, it's a good question.
It is. Because, on the one hand, you've got Erasmus, this super influential scholar and critic back in the 1500s. But then the social five type, they're known for being intellectual, kind of detached, but also really altruistic, wanting to use knowledge to make the world better.
Right.
So do those two pictures actually match up? That's what we're trying to figure out.
Well, that's what's so cool about the Enneagram, right?
Right.
I mean,
But
it gives us a framework to understand these historical figures
mm,
in a totally new way.
mm,
It's like we could look beyond just the dates and events
yeah.
and start to get a feel for their motivations, their fears,
Hmm.
even their desires.
Exactly. And suddenly history isn't just a bunch of names and dates anymore. It becomes about real people, people we can connect with on a deeper level.
Yeah, for sure.
So with Erasmus, one of the first things that jumps out at me from these sources is, well, his intellectual curiosity.
Oh, yeah.
This guy was interested in everything.
It's true.
Theology, philosophy, linguistics, social criticism,
Mm-hmm.
you name it, he was into it.
Like a Renaissance Wikipedia or something.
Uh-huh, exactly. But the key here, what might point to him being a social five, is that he didn't just absorb all this information, he used it.
To challenge the status quo,
Exactly.
which is classic social five, right? They're driven by this thirst for knowledge. But it's not just for the sake of knowing.
Yeah.
They want to apply it, to share it, and ultimately to use it to make a positive impact.
Okay, so that brings us to his most famous work, The Praise of Folly. Full disclosure, I haven't actually read the whole
Well,
thing,
it's fantastic.
but I know it's this masterpiece of satire, right?
It absolutely is, and it's such a perfect example of how a social five might use their knowledge
Hmm.
in a really unique way.
So how so?
Well, Erasmus doesn't just present these dry academic arguments.
Right.
Instead, he creates this hilarious, biting critique of society, especially targeting the hypocrisy and corruption he saw in powerful institutions like the church.
Ah, so instead of writing some dense philosophical treatise that only other scholars would read,
Right.
he used humor and satire to reach a much wider audience.
Exactly. He packaged these complex ideas and critiques in a way that was entertaining and thought-provoking.
It's like smuggling serious stuff into the mainstream under the cover of humor,
Uh-huh. Exactly.
which, if you think about it, is pretty brilliant.
Oh, yeah.
And this idea of using humor to point out flaws or to advocate for change, it's something we can all relate to, right? Haven't we all used sarcasm or a well-placed meme to make a point about something we care about?
All the time. That's what's so fascinating about looking at Erasmus through this lens.
Hmm.
We can see how these core traits of the social five, the desire for knowledge, the drive to make a difference, they can manifest in these unexpected ways.
Okay, so we're starting to see some potential social five tendencies in Erasmus. But there's another characteristic that often comes up with this type. And it might seem a little contradictory at first: emotional detachment.
Right.
I know that doesn't sound like a positive trait, but the sources suggest it's actually a key part of how social fives operate in the world.
It's true, and
Yeah.
it's not about lacking empathy or being cold-hearted. It's
Okay.
more about being able to step back from a situation and view it objectively without getting swept up in the emotions.
So for Erasmus, this might have meant being able to engage with these complex social and intellectual issues without getting overly emotional or losing his cool.
Precisely. This detachment allowed him to analyze situations from multiple perspectives, weigh the evidence carefully, and ultimately arrive at his own conclusions.
I see.
It also probably helped him stay true to his own convictions, even when facing criticism or opposition.
Which he definitely did throughout his life.
Oh, absolutely.
That makes a lot of sense. And there's this fascinating anecdote about Erasmus that really brings this idea of detachment to life.
Oh, yeah.
It said that he was so devoted to learning and acquiring knowledge that he would often prioritize books over basic necessities.
Oh, yeah, the story about him sacrificing food and clothing to expand his library.
That's the
It
one.
really gets to the heart of the social five's relationship with knowledge.
Yeah.
It's not just a hobby for them. It's an essential need, something worth making sacrifices for.
It really makes you wonder what drives someone to that level of dedication.
Yeah.
What have you been passionate enough about to make real sacrifices for? It's a powerful question, isn't it?
It is.
Hmm.
And I think it speaks to the power of intellectual curiosity, that deep desire to understand the world around us.
Hmm.
And in Erasmus's case, it seemed that books were the key to unlocking that understanding.
Okay, so we've talked about his intellectual curiosity, his tendency towards detachment, and his use of satire as a tool for social commentary. But the sources also highlight a fascinating connection between Erasmus and another social five figure, a man named Claudio Naranjo.
Ah, yes,
Who's
Naranjo,
Naranjo?
a renowned psychiatrist and Enneagram expert, lived centuries after Erasmus, of course.
Right.
But what's remarkable is how much these two men had in common, despite the vast differences in their time periods and professions.
So what were some of the key parallels between them?
One of the most striking similarities was their shared passion for educational reform.
Okay.
Both Erasmus and Naranjo believed that the traditional approaches to education, they were deeply flawed. Yeah. They felt that too much emphasis was placed on rote memorization and blind obedience to authority,
Uh-huh.
and that this stifled critical thinking and personal growth.
So it wasn't just about acquiring knowledge for them, it was about how that knowledge was used, how
Right.
it shaped individuals and society.
Precisely. Both Erasmus and Naranjo. They advocated for deeper, more meaningful approaches to learning,
Okay.
approaches that would empower individuals to think for themselves, to question assumptions, and to develop a strong sense of self-awareness.
And that was essential for creating a more just and enlightened society.
Yeah. In their view.
Wow. That's a pretty powerful vision, especially considering they lived centuries apart.
I know, right?
It really highlights the timeless nature of these ideas and their relevance to our own lives today.
It does, doesn't it? And it speaks to the potential impact of a social five's desire to use their knowledge to improve the world.
Yeah.
They see the flaws in existing systems and they strive to create something better.
So speaking of Erasmus's desire to create a better world, the sources point to his prolific letter writing as another avenue where his social five tendencies might have come through.
Interesting.
Apparently, he corresponded with some of the most brilliant minds of his time, exchanging ideas, engaging in these lively debates on a wide range of topics.
Yes, his letters. They offer a fascinating glimpse into his intellectual world.
Yeah.
And what's striking is that, even in his personal correspondence, we see that same drive to engage with ideas, to analyze, to dissect, to offer his own unique perspective.
It makes me think about the way we connect with others today through social media, email, even texting.
Yeah.
Do you think those platforms allow for the same kind of deep intellectual exchange that Erasmus enjoyed through his letters?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's certainly possible to have meaningful conversations online, but there's something about the slow, deliberate nature of letter writing that allow for a level of depth and nuance that can be difficult to achieve in our fast-paced digital world.
Yeah, I see your point. It's like the difference between having a quick chat with a friend and sitting down for a long, thoughtful conversation.
Right.
Both have their place, but sometimes you need that extended time and space to really delve into complex ideas.
Exactly. And I think that's something Erasmus understood intuitively. He recognized the value of taking the time to think deeply, to engage with different perspectives, and to articulate his own ideas with precision and clarity.
And this brings us back to that idea of emotional detachment. While it may have helped him stay objective in his scholarly work, do you think it could have also been a barrier to forming truly intimate relationships?
That's a really thought-provoking question.
Yeah.
And one that often comes up when discussing the social five personality type.
Yeah.
While detachment can be an asset in certain situations, it can also make it difficult to fully open up emotionally and connect with others on a deeper level.
So it's a double-edged sword in a way.
Exactly.
It can be a source of strength and insight, but also a potential obstacle to forming meaningful connections.
Precisely. And I think that's an important nuance to keep in mind. When considering Erasmus as a social five, he may have been brilliant and insightful, but he was also a complex human being with his own strengths and weaknesses, just like all of us.
Right. Okay, so we're starting to get a pretty well-rounded picture of Erasmus here. But before we wrap up our deep dive, I wanted to circle back to the praise of folly one more time,
Okay.
because it really seems to be the key to understanding him and his potential social five leanings. You mentioned earlier that it's a masterpiece of satire. But I'm curious, can you give us some specific examples of how Erasmus used humor to expose the hypocrisy he saw in the world around him?
Of course. One of the most famous passages in The Praise of Folly is where Folly, the narrator and personification of folly itself, mocks the pompous theologians of the time. She describes them as being so puffed up with knowledge that they can't even see the obvious truths right in front of their noses.
Wow. That's pretty cutting, even by today's standards.
It is. And that's what made Erasmus's satire so effective.
Hmm.
He didn't shy away from pointing out the absurdity of those in power, but he did it with such wit and intelligence that it was hard to dismiss his criticisms.
It's like he was using humor as a weapon to dismantle those systems of power and expose the flaws in the thinking of the elite.
That's a great way to put it. And it perfectly aligns with the Social Five's desire to challenge authority and expose hypocrisy.
It also makes me wonder if Erasmus's choice to write The Praise of Folly as a satire was a deliberate strategy to avoid direct confrontation or persecution. Do you think there's a connection there?
That's a very astute observation. It's certainly possible that Erasmus saw satire as a way to deliver his critiques
Yeah.
without putting himself in direct danger.
Right.
After all, he was living in a time when speaking out against the church could have serious consequences.
So in a way, his humor could have been a form of self-preservation, allowing him to address these sensitive issues in a way that was both entertaining and subversive.
Precisely. And that's what makes satire such a powerful tool.
Yeah.
It can disarm opponents,
Yeah.
make them laugh at themselves, and ultimately open their minds to new ideas.
Which ultimately seems to have been Erasmus's goal. He wasn't just trying to entertain people with his wit. He was trying to make them think, to question, to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. And that's why, despite living over 500 years ago, Erasmus's work continues to resonate with readers today. His message of critical thinking, intellectual freedom, and the importance of challenging assumptions. It's as relevant now as it ever was.
You know, it's interesting to consider how his social five tendencies, that detachment, that drive to understand the world, might have actually fueled his creativity and given him the courage to speak out against the injustices he saw around him.
Yeah.
It's almost like his personality was tailor-made for the role he played in history.
That's a fascinating way to look at it. It suggests that our personality traits, even the ones that might seem negative on the surface, can actually be strengths when channeled in the right direction.
Okay, so we've explored Erasmus's intellectual pursuits, his tendency towards detachment, his use of satire, and his connections with other social five figures. But there's one more element that I think is crucial to understanding him. Through this Enneagram lens,
And what's that?
it's Erasmus's absolute love of books. I mean, this guy was a true bibliophile.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Right.
That passion for books, for the knowledge they hold, it's a real hallmark of the Social Five.
Makes sense.
They see books as portals to different worlds, different ways of thinking, and they crave that intellectual stimulation, that feeling of expanding their minds, deepening their understanding of the world.
Okay, it's like each book is a key that unlocks a new room in this vast mansion of knowledge.
I love that.
Right.
And Erasmus, with his huge library and never-ending thirst for knowledge, he was clearly a master explorer of that mansion.
Yeah, he really was.
He just devoured books on every subject imaginable, always seeking new insights and perspectives.
And it wasn't just about passively absorbing information either, right?
Right. He was actively engaging with the ideas, analyzing them, critiquing them, synthesizing them into his own unique worldview.
So for someone like Erasmus, books weren't just for entertainment or escape.
Yeah.
They were essential tools for his intellectual and creative work.
Absolutely.
Fuel for his fire.
Exactly. And that passion for knowledge, that drive to understand and engage with the world through books, it's something that really sets the Social Five apart.
You know, as we've been talking about Erasmus and his love of books, it's made me think about my own relationship with reading.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I've gotten out of the habit lately, but hearing about Erasmus's dedication, it makes me want to dust off those bookshelves and rediscover the joy of getting lost in a good book.
Oh, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the busyness of life and forget about that.
It really is.
That simple pleasure of learning and exploring new ideas.
Yeah.
But there's something truly magical about the way a book can transport you to another time and place, introduce you to fascinating characters, and challenge you to think in new ways.
It's like a mini vacation for the mind.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe by reconnecting with our own inner bibliophile, we can tap into some of that same intellectual curiosity and drive.
Yeah.
That made Erasmus such a remarkable figure.
I love that idea. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of Erasmus of Rotterdam, let's try to answer that initial question.
Okay.
Does he really fit the mold of a social five on the Enneagram?
Based on everything we've discussed, I think the evidence is pretty compelling.
Yeah.
His insatiable intellectual curiosity, his tendency towards emotional detachment, his brilliant use of satire to critique society, his deep commitment to learning and knowledge,
Yeah.
and his passion for using his insights to improve the world All of these point towards a strong social 5 personality.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Isn't it?
I mean, by understanding him through this Enneagram lens, we gain a whole new appreciation for his work and its impact on history. It's like we've been given a key to unlock the secrets of his genius.
I completely agree. It reminds us that behind every great thinker, every influential figure, there's a unique personality, a set of motivations and desires that shape their worldview
Yeah.
and drive their actions.
And in Erasmus's case, it seems that his social 5 tendencies played a significant role in shaping his legacy as a scholar, social critic, and champion of intellectual freedom.
Yes, and
Yeah.
it makes you wonder, what other historical figures could we understand better through this lens?
Hmm.
What insights might we gain by exploring the Enneagram types of other influential thinkers, artists, and leaders throughout history?
It's a great question to ponder as we continue our own explorations of history and the human experience. And for anyone listening who is intrigued by this idea of the Enneagram, I highly recommend delving deeper into this fascinating system of personality typing.
Oh, absolutely.
You might be surprised by what you discover about yourself and the people around you.
It's a journey of self-discovery that can be both enlightening and empowering.
Well, thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the world of Erasmus of Rotterdam. It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope you've learned something new along the way.